There's also risk from reputational risks. So consumers are also demanding products which are more sustainable. There's also a risk from the disruption to your supply chain. So whether you are directly or indirectly dependent on natural resources, you are somehow or the other going to face some kind of a business risk that will emanate from lack of consideration for biodiversity and climate change. The other thing that we are starting to see increasingly is the impact of these so-called natural disasters. And India has been seeing these on an annual basis now. And these impact not just society, but they also impact businesses. And there are billions and billions of rupees that are lost as a result of these natural disasters. However, we also know now that these are not necessarily purely natural disasters, but they're a combination of both climate change impacts and the destruction of natural ecosystems and processes. So whether it is the constriction of rivers or construction on wetlands, these are things that are going to have an impact on biodiversity and on risk impacts. So in a way, climate change, biodiversity, and economic development are completely linked. They're interlinked, and we can't really separate them from each other, and we can't address them in isolation. So to mitigate impacts of climate change, we need to protect biodiversity. And protection of biodiversity and natural resources, in turn, will help to mitigate the impacts of climate change. We also know that India is likely to be one of the top countries impacted by climate change globally. This will be both from temperature rise, changes in rainfall patterns, up to 30% disruption in rainfall patterns have been predicted, and also from sea level rise. Climate change impacts, if you look at various reports, are expected to cost up to 3% of our GDP by 2050. A more recent report talked about water risk and the fact that water risk will impact up to 6% of our GDP by 2050. These are alarming figures, something that we need to take very, very seriously.
And the report ICIMOD has released earlier this year called HIMAP report, Hindu Kush Himalayan Monitoring and Assessment Report. And this report essentially deals with climate change, mountains, sustainability, and people. And one of the main motivation for ICIMOD as an intergovernmental organization to carry out this report is in many of the IPCC report, Assessment 4, Assessment 5, the Himalayan region had been the blank spot in terms of data, information to have a proper assessment. So ICIMOD led an effort 4 years back, together with more than 350 scientists from this part of the region, more than 80% of the scientists from this part of the region, to do a comprehensive assessment on the current state of the knowledge about the climate change. And these are some summary of this report, and this is also open access by the Springer. So you can also download 650-page report on the Himalayan ecosystem as such. If you look at the temperature, there is an elevation-dependent warming. The more you go higher in the mountains, the higher the temperature rises. Now, if we say by the IPCC 1.5 degree report, even if we contain by 1.5 degree Celsius by the end of this century, mountains temperature rise is expected to rise by 2.1 degrees Celsius. So the key message is even 1.5 degree is too hot for the mountain. And what it means in terms of impact is one of the key impact is a melting of glaciers. So it is estimated that 1/3 of our glaciers will be lost by end of this century.
Biodiversity and sustainability, they are two sides of the same coin. They are intrinsically linked. What NedSpice did approximately about 7 years ago, we identified that we needed to get more controls on the agricultural side of the supply chain, and that we needed to take care of the production and to train and to work with farmers. So what we did initially, we started an operation in Vietnam on pepper cultivation. And just to give you some idea on figures, on pepper now we're working on 43 villages in Binh Phuc province. We have 1,500 farmers and we produce about 4,000 tonnes of sustainable pepper. So that's what we're doing in Vietnam. We moved that then to India, and to start with we set up an operation in Rajasthan on cumin seed production for the sustainable production of cumin seed, and we now have 42 villages in Rajasthan, 650 farmers. We've got about 7,000 hectares, and this year we'll produce somewhere in the region of about 1,500 tonnes of sustainable cumin. So these are the kind of things that can be achieved. And we also have another project on turmeric, which we started, I think, now 5 years ago. And we have 16 villages in an area of Kadapa in Andhra Pradesh. We've got 260 farmers, and we're producing about 800 tonnes of sustainable turmeric.
Now biodiversity is also an issue for business. In the beginning it was more the niche companies, for instance ecotourism was always mentioned, bioprospecting initiatives, organic agriculture. Now we have a more broader awareness on biodiversity in the last years from the industry sector, and this has apparently to do also with very severe changes in our nature, due also to the climate change effects that we see, that raise awareness under the consumers on one hand, and so also provokes the industry to change when the consumer comes to them and asks for their impact on nature and on biodiversity.